Triumph lent me one of their Scrambler 1200 XEs for a couple of weeks, and I'll be up front, I loved this bike. Although it's the off-road bias spec, I had a great time commuting around London on it, and when it went back to Triumph I was definitely sad to see it go. That said, no bike is perfect, so here are my 10 favourite things about it, and then a few niggles too. The Scrambler XE uses the 1200cc Bonneville parallel twin engine. This motor comes in a couple of variants, the high torque, which is used in the likes of the Street Twin, T120 and T100 and the Bobbers, or the high power, which is used here as well as in the Speed Twin and Thruxton. But don't let the name fool you. Yes, it might have a bit more poke at the top end than the Bobber, but ultimately all of the Bonneville motors are built to deliver dollops of torque almost anywhere in the rev range. That makes for an awesome bike to ride around town as it pulls away from the lights effortlessly without a great deal of provocation from the throttle. I've been mainly riding in London, commuting on this bike, and I've got to say this motor is pretty lovely for just razzing away from the lights. But that's the best thing I can say about it really. It's got bags of torque in the low and mid range. It does have a bit of a burst when you get it up to sort of 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 revs. That's where you get the peak power, and it's up at 90 odd, so there's plenty to go at. But really I don't think that's how most people are going to ride this bike. It's about that really strong pull like that. You just wind it straight on and it takes off. No problems. The nature of the motor really complements the rest of the bike well. It's a big, tall, wide machine and deserves a tractor-like motor that you feel could get you out of any situation. The Scramblers are both well spec'd with fully adjustable Showa forks and Öhlins piggyback shocks, but the XE has a slightly more robust off-road bias setup with 47mm forks to the 45 of the XC, and both front and rear have 50mm more travel at 250 rather than the 200mm of the road-biased XC. I've heard a couple of people say that they found the suspension a little bit firm. I mean, it's beautiful stuff that they've put on it. Those Öhlins shocks at the rear, you know, and they said they've adjusted it as well. It's fully adjustable front and rear, but still not being able to find a setting that they like. I mean, personally, I don't find it too bad, but I think it all depends on what you're currently riding. My Street Twin, for example, I've put Hagen progressive springs on and some Hagen shocks on the rear. They definitely firm it up. So this feels kind of similar to me. The seat is quite thin in terms of padding as well, so I think that combo for people who like a very cushy ride and a cushy seat is perhaps not what they're looking for, but I personally have quite liked the suspension. Maybe it does have a similar firmness to what I'm used to, but also it's got so much travel. This XE is built for off-roading, and it's got a good, I think, 200mm more travel than the XC, which is a little bit more road orientated. And it just gives you so much confidence, and I know that sounds ridiculous living in London, but it just feels like it'll take whatever you can throw at it. And where else do you get that in like a retro classy styled package? You know, it's not something that you see a lot of. Maybe something like the V85 TT from Moto Guzzi, but I don't think it looks quite as nice as this. On a related note, I absolutely loved the ride height of this bike. The 870mm seat height is definitely on the tall side, and with a 207kg dry weight, it's not particularly light. So you have to plan ahead a little and make sure you're properly set up to balance the bike when you come to a stop, especially if you've got short legs like me. In fact, some riders might feel more comfortable on the 840mm seat height of the XC, but what you do get from the taller XE is awesome visibility over the traffic and the feeling that you're riding a more substantial bike. My Street Twin, for example, is slung pretty low, and although that's nice to have such an easy reach to the floor on both sides, I love this sort of commanding position, and not only can you see over cars quite easily and see ahead and make a bit of an assessment of which route to take, but also you feel like people can see you better as well. I guess it's a bit like driving a 4x4 or something. There's just something about being up high in a big machine that feels quite good. I was honestly expecting this bike to be a bit of a handful for me. I'm used to commuting and filtering on my Street Twin, which is very low and feels small beneath you. It's also got much narrower bars at 785mm to the XE's 905. But the Scrambler 1200 is surprisingly nimble given its size. After a few minutes of my first ride, I started to feel confident and was making progress almost as quickly as I do on my own bike. The 21-inch front wheel still flicks pretty well, possibly owing to the fact that the wide bars give you so much leverage.
Just because it's a big old beast though, doesn't mean it's not agile. I mean, this is why I came this route, because it's probably the most congested route I can take home, and I wanted to show you that you can still make progress quite easily on this bike. A lot of people comment on my channel saying, why don't you, even with my Street Twin, what's the point in riding a 900cc motorcycle in this traffic, and surely like a little scooter would be better. But actually, I think a motorcycle is just as nimble as a scooter. The actual body of it is pretty narrow. It's got a really decent lock on it as well. You can see these recesses in the tank here. That means even despite those big chunky 47mm forks, you can get a really good lock on it. So the turning circle's good.
The bike is also nicely balanced, which gives you plenty of confidence at low speed, which is a necessity in London.
Look at how balanced it is, even when you slow right down. This is what I'm saying, it's very easy to ride in traffic. I was quite skeptical that it would be, given how big and tall it is, but I've really got on with it this week. I've just jumped on it and loved every minute of riding it in town.
However, should you get yourself into a bit of a pickle in traffic, you've got great stopping power on hand to haul the bike up quickly. At the front there's twin Brembo 320mm discs with M50 4-pot radial monoblock calipers, and at the rear a single 2-pot Brembo.
You wouldn't really expect anything other than pretty good stopping power from those Brembos at front. They're huge, and the rear brake does its job as well. It doesn't have sharp initial bite, and I've come to the conclusion that pretty much across all Triumphs, these modern classics anyway, they don't really have a very sharp sports bike type bite to them. This has got a Brembo master cylinder and the Brembo calipers as well, the M50s. So I don't think it's a hardware thing, I think it's by design. Yes, it's a big bike, it's heavy, so it's going to feel, well, you'll feel the weight of it with one finger on it. But certainly when I was riding the Street Triple, granted that's a much lighter bike, but still it did have a certain sharpness to it when you used one or two fingers to brake. So I think maybe it's just to make it a little bit more retro feeling to ride, or a little bit more accessible. But there's loads of power once you do give it a good squeeze. It always happens when you're riding in town traffic that someone's going to slam their brakes on in front of you, and despite its weight, it stops pretty well. One thing I do like is this adjustable master cylinder. You can adjust span and ratio, whereas it's just the span on the XC. So there's 3 settings. I think it's 21mm, 20mm and 19mm. Gives you a little bit more travel, I think, in a 19mm setting, and that gives you more modulation, I suppose. Of course, this bike's got your rider modes and ABS, and you'd be expecting that to save you in the wet. But I actually found knocking it down to the 19mm setting and that bit of extra travel actually gives you a little bit more feel, or a bit less immediacy, and that's, I think, a really nice feature to have on a bike like this, where you do want to ride it in all weather conditions.
But you can sharpen them back up again when the roads are dry and the pace picks up. One of my favourite features of the Scrambler is this TFT dash. Although it's somewhat at odds with the retro aesthetics of the overall bike, I think it's worth it just for the sheer levels of functionality you get from it. It's really easy to read, and I like the different options of a modern layout versus something more traditional, and the light mode for day and dark mode for dimmer conditions or night. Everything is administered through the buttons and joystick on the switchgear, and I found it all super easy to get along with. It looks like this setup will be present on the upcoming Rocket too, which is great news, as it was honestly one of my favourite features of the bike. It gives a premium technological feel, especially when you set it against some of the other bikes in Triumph's modern classic range, like the Speed Twin that I'm currently riding. Through the screen, you can administer a wealth of riding modes, with the XE having the most comprehensive selection of any of the modern classics. There's Sport, Road, Rain, Off-Road, Off-Road Pro and Rider Configurable, all of which affect throttle response, ABS and traction control intervention. Off-Road Pro is the only one exclusive to the XE that doesn't appear on the XC, and this disables all electronic aids, hence the Pro name. The ABS and traction control are also lean sensitive on this bike, owing to the IMU or inertial measurement unit, which feeds lean data back to the ECU, another feature which isn't present on the XC. So there's loads to play with there, but ultimately I was switching between Sport in the dry, which gives you the most throttle response and liveliness, and Rain mode in the wet. The duller feeling throttle is definitely reassuring when it's really heaving down. I also enjoyed playing with the other modes and concluded that the XE is the best retro bike in Triumph's range in terms of the ability to dial in your exact preferences. I also love the finish on this bike, with loads of nice little touches that distinguish it and for me warrant its premium pricing of £12,300. It's the only modern classic, for example, that has a seamless tank which looks very neat indeed. There's a lovely tank strap too, and a Monza fuel cap to finish it off. I also like the brushed metal finish on some of the components, like the sprocket cover, which give it a sturdy look, and the brushed aluminium mudguards also finish it nicely. The LED brake light also stood out to me as particularly well designed, as did the belly pan and the cast aluminium swing arm. The more I looked at it over the 2 weeks, the more I found stuff that I liked. Despite the range having largely similar motors, Triumph have done a neat job of giving each bike a bit of its own character with different exhaust setups. The Scrambler certainly has its own sound, with 2 pipes down one side of the bike projecting out backwards. It's got a lovely deep tone, some occasional pops on deceleration and plenty of character to it. I won't say too much here, but I'll just let you listen to some footage where I moved my helmet mic into my pocket to pick up the sound. This last point is not so much a feature, but a feeling that this bike gives you. The tall riding position, long travel suspension, torquey motor, advanced riding modes, big wheels and semi-off-road tyres, handguards as standard, and decent engine protection underneath, all combine to make you feel like you can ride this bike anywhere, even if you aren't doing the Baja 1000 every day. London has its fair share of crappy road surfaces, as well as weird little gravel lanes that exist from a time when South London was more of a collection of villages than a sprawling suburbia that it is today. There are also times when you're out doing errands and you need to pop the bike up on the curb to park for a couple of minutes. Doing all of this stuff is fine, for example, on my Street Twin, but you do still grimace as you roll off a curb or over some potholes as you hope you don't do any damage. But with the Scrambler 1200, it's the opposite. Because you know that it's a genuinely capable bike, you almost look forward to obstacles. You find the little side roads, middle the puddles, and seek out opportunities to ride it like you're on an adventure. But as I always say, no bike is perfect, so here are a few things I'd change about this big old beast. Some items on the finish could be improved. The indicators look way too big and bulbous to me, especially set next to the small headlight. The ratios just look a bit off, and the back of the dash looks unfinished. You can see the mounts and cables. If I was skeptical, I might say that it's no coincidence that Triumph have a fly screen accessory and some better looking indicators too. But whether you go for Triumph accessories or a third party, a couple of quick mods would neaten it up quite nicely. Yes, I found the height of the bike easier to get on with than expected, but there were a couple of occasions where it definitely limited my progress through traffic. Sometimes when you're filtering, you might need to waddle the bike back a little to then make a sharp turn through a gap. Because I was on tiptoes either side, it was pretty much impossible for me to waddle the bike back, especially if I was on an incline.
Oh, look at that sun going down. Box myself in a little bit there. I could definitely fit through there on my street twin. But like, because I can barely touch the floor, it's quite hard to back the bike up on my tiptoes up this bridge. So I can't roll it back and get through there.
And again, although the 905mm wide bars give the Scrambler 1200 a really commanding feel and great stability and leverage, they obviously don't fit through gaps as easily as some bikes. In fairness, this is the off-road bias variant of the Scrambler. It's not really designed for city riding. The road-going XE has narrower bars at 840mm, which would be much better for filtering.
I mean, this is a good example of when the width might limit you, when you can just see a row of cars like this and you're like, yes, can get through there. Yes, can get through there. Normally on my street twin I might peep through there, but not today. I have to wait for a little gap to open like this and then wait for the wing mirror gods to work their magic, and yeah, you can sail through. But I reckon by virtue of that alone, I'd be quicker getting to work on my street twin than on this bike.
This is a well-publicised complaint about the Scrambler 1200, but it's worth reiterating that the high-level pipes are warm on the inside of your leg.
Like when you get in traffic like this and you got to stop at the lights, you know, I've not got the longest legs, so my left foot stays on the shifter just in case I want to pop it in neutral to save me holding the clutch in, and that means my right leg is straight down to reach down to the floor, which means that the inside of it is touching on the exhaust. You do feel the warmth. I mean, it's October now, so not the hottest month by any stretch of the imagination, but in summer I can imagine that that's hot. I think you can probably learn to keep your leg away from it a little bit, and it's just a bit of a compromise for style, I suppose. I also heard there's an accessory come in to sort of help with it a little bit. I'd imagine that would be something like an extended shield or something that stands a little bit further off it. So that might be something to keep your eyes peeled for if you own it and find it a little bit of a problem.
Although keyless ignition sounds cool on the face of it, if you live in London, you need to use the steering lock every time you park the bike, as well as a bunch of other locks too. The steering lock is located where the ignition would normally be, so essentially you're doing the same thing as a bike with a regular key, but you just put it back in your pocket after you've unlocked it. And ultimately you just end up with a bigger key because of the wireless tech. The bike could potentially be a good tourer in that it has plenty of power, good brakes, good suspension, good tech, and a comfy, commanding riding position. I did a bit of motorway riding and it's easily capable of cruising at 70 miles an hour and beyond, and it feels really planted, and I really enjoyed the cruise control too. But the wind blast is pretty severe, as you would expect on an essentially naked bike, so it wouldn't be able to compete for comfort with something like a Tiger over long distances. Yes, there's the fly screen accessory, but that's not the same as a proper big screen. In addition, luggage options are limited to a tank bag, duffel bag on a rack, and a single-sided pannier because of the exhaust. That's still plenty of capacity for the short haul, but again can't compete with the full luggage of a bike like the Tiger.
I actually got a puncture on this bike the other day. I went up to sort of Cambridge area to meet up with Unparalleled Twin, who has the XE. I'll link to that video in the description. We talked about the differences between the two bikes and why he chose that one. Really enjoyed it, but yeah, on the way back I got a puncture on the front. It was flat by the time I got home. I think I picked it up on the motorway somewhere, so thank God it didn't go down too quickly, otherwise I'd been stuck somewhere on the M11. Thankfully these Triumph press bikes have Triumph Assist, which is the sort of RAC cover, so someone came out and plugged it. Thank you very much to that bloke, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to make this video today. It would have just gone back tomorrow to Triumph with a flat front. But yeah, on that ill-fated motorway ride, because it was quite wet and there was a lot of debris on the road because it was quite windy, I guess, and yeah, it was raining quite a bit. It wasn't the most pleasant ride, but it really occurred to me when the sort of wind's blowing in your face and the rain's being sprayed up in your face and you can't really see because it's all over your visor. I'm not sure if I would seriously call this an adventure bike if adventure means to you plenty of big miles.
But realistically, this isn't a full-on transcontinental adventure bike. It's more of a good-looking, capable, fun bike that would be awesome for day trips or weekends away that don't involve too many motorway miles. So it might be worth framing it in your mind as a day or weekend adventure bike, and for that, it's perfect. Despite some of these shortcomings, all in all, this has been one of my favourite bikes to review in recent memory, mainly because there's not much else like it. It's a bit like a monster truck in a retro package, and it's all so beautifully designed and put together, and has great tech to play with too. It's not a big miles tourer, but for those mini adventures, it'll definitely put a smile on your face, and I certainly had a great time razzing around London on it.